Hi, everyone. I'm Ashi Mishra, the Chief of Staff with the Democratic Youth Coalition. We represent an inclusive national grassroots movement of young activists participating in civic engagement programs that support democratic and progressive campaigns and causes. The youth vote is extremely important, not only for presidential elections, but for all future elections, and our work will ensure that the U.S. continues to receive strong youth and student engagement. Today, I'm very happy to be hosting potentially the nation's first millennial governor and Maryland's first state governor of color, Ashwani Jain. Thank you so much for being here. The DYC is very excited to hear more about your platform and ideas on policy.
No, thank you so much for the work you do, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Okay, wonderful. We can get started with you telling me a little bit about yourself as well as how you got involved in politics.
Yeah, so my name is Ashwani Jain. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a 31-year-old who's been lucky enough to beat cancer and go from a Make-A-Wish kid to a Make-A-Wish ambassador. I'm a product of public schools. I've also been able to work in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, as well as serve in President Obama and then Vice President Biden's White House and two federal agencies. And yes, I'm now running an inclusive and accessible campaign to be Maryland's next governor. Now, if elected next year in our election, I would serve as the nation's first millennial governor and Maryland's first governor of color, as you mentioned. But while a voice like mine has never been in our governor's office before, the state of Maryland is younger and more diverse than it's ever been. And so voices like mine are growing and I feel need to be represented. And so with a completely vacant governor seat, I'm running for two main reasons. The first is to change the narrative of who deserves a seat at the table, right? Because I think decisions about us should not be made without us. And you all as a group really understand that. And then the second reason I'm running is to make sure we stop having the same debates in every election cycle. And the way that I'm going to do that is by focusing on a relief recovery reform platform that uses these issues in a comprehensive way and addresses what we can do in the short term and long term. And so, at the end of the day, I think a governor really is one who should understand both how the systems of power work as well as the real impact of policies. And I believe that I have the perspective, the experience, and the empathy needed based on my professional and personal experiences to do the job well.
Perfect. I love personally that that how you plan on countering issues involves this three-step process that not only like looks at what the issues are, but how to go about addressing them. I think that is really important. What do you believe the biggest and most pressing issue that Maryland is facing today is, and how would you go about solving it?
So what I've seen, going around the state, talking to folks and just being a resident of the state, being active, when we talk about COVID relief, climate change, criminal justice reform, affordable housing, equitable education, healthcare, all these issues are really important and need to be addressed right away. And the way that, like I said, I approach that is by looking at them in a comprehensive system. And I think if you do that, not only are you stopping putting these issues in silos, but you're really going to stop the same issues and the same debates in every election cycle and really start to reform the systems and have more sustainable change. And the way that I start with all of this is also talking about reforming the systems themselves. Because I think once you have structural reforms, then all the other issues are much easier to really reform. And so when I talk about structural changes, I'm talking about inclusion, banning corruption, and ensuring equal access. And whether or not you live in Maryland, I think these are all issues that a lot of folks can get behind. And so when I talk about inclusion, I'm talking about gender diversity on the ticket if I have the honor of winning the nomination, making sure that my administration that I create is really diverse and reflects the diversity of my state, because I think representation matters and it dictates how policy is going to be implemented and enforced, right? When I talk about banning corruption, making sure that if you're a governor or a lieutenant governor, or if you run an agency, you can't own or trade a stock while in office, you can't have a business, and there's also a 4-year lobbying ban after you leave office. And then the final piece, as I mentioned, is equal access. So the one thing that I've committed from the day I kicked off my campaign is that every event I host is going to be free and open to the press. I think that is one way to get money out of politics and also ensures that it's a more accessible and inclusive campaign. I'm also not taking any money from corporations or businesses. and also reaching out to different areas around the state that may not have high voting numbers, but they're still part of our community. And so I think if you talk about those structural changes, as well as talk about issues in a comprehensive way, I think that's what Marylanders are looking for. And I think people in general, progressives in general, really are looking forward to.
So going back sort of to what you were talking about at putting a spot on the table in terms of inclusivity, I know that a significant part of your platform involves inclusivity for women, people of color, those with disabilities, and the LGBTQ plus community. So how do you think you can specifically increase inclusivity within Maryland for these communities, as well as accessibility to jobs and other resources?
So I think the first is making sure they have a seat at the table by relating to them, right? I think one of the things that we have seen people who run for higher office, especially governor, is they only talk about their understanding of how the systems of power work. And for me, I understand that, right? I've advocated for public policy at all levels of government, all across my state. I've worked in leadership roles with President Obama and then Vice President Biden. But more importantly, and this is really touching on your question, I am a native of my state. I'm a product of public schools. I grew up seeing my parents struggle to grow a small business while keeping the lights on in our 2-bedroom apartment. I've lived in densely populated urban areas as well as rural suburbs surrounded by farms and forests and rivers. I'm a son of immigrants who's been bullied by racists because of my name and my brown skin, right? I'm a young person, a millennial, who's often been told to sit down and be quiet even when I was the project manager. And I'm also an 18-year cancer survivor who's battled both physical and mental health issues and never thought I would get a second chance at life. And I think when I talk about my personal experiences and tying into these different communities, I understand what it feels like to be marginalized, to not have a seat at the table, to not look at policies that are inclusive and accessible. And I think that is a starting point. And then it goes back into the specific issues that I'm advocating for. And something even as simple as my website, right? My website right now is accessible in 6 different languages. There's a lot more videos as well as text, just to make sure that people who have different kinds of backgrounds and different accessibility methods are able to understand what I'm running for and why I'm running. And then just the way in which I campaign, right? Not only reaching out to the same voters that vote in every election cycle, but going outside of that, reaching out to rural communities, high schools, colleges, universities, nonprofits, religious institutions, places that really touch a lot of these different marginalized groups, but don't necessarily get reached out to by elected officials or candidates.
Yeah, in regards to education, how do you plan on bridging the gap within education between lower income and underfunded communities with those higher income communities? And what must happen at the local, state, or even federal level to ensure equity in education?
So one, I think it's, again, having a representative who understands not just the data points, but has lived through some of those discrepancies. I was born and raised in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is one of the biggest counties in the state, as well as one of the wealthiest counties. And yet I still attended a Title I elementary school. So that is a school that's severely underfunded, had mold on the ceilings, overcrowded by students, but also great educators who just didn't have the support they need. Years later, when I was battling cancer, I remember how the ecosystem of my public school, everyone from the bus driver, the cafeteria lady, the counselor, the teachers, the fellow students, right? Everyone, the whole place became a safe place where I felt supported. And so as a starting point, really understanding what it feels like to be in a school or to be in a system that there's a lot of discrepancies, I think is critical. In terms of specifics, right, I'm working on making sure we're reducing the teacher shortage, increasing the pipeline of diverse teachers, decreasing the teacher-student ratio, and again, reprioritizing the funding so that regardless of what your zip code is, you are getting the same resources. Part of that includes forgiving student debt for educators, making sure we're easing some of the educational requirements, again, to reduce some of those barriers to entry and recruit more teachers, making sure we're also addressing affordable housing so that a lot of the teachers who cannot afford to live in the same cities that they teach in can do so, making sure we're expanding broadband. That's especially important as we learned with COVID. making sure that we're investing in trade schools as well, right? Easing the requirements for students who qualify for different community college scholarships, looking at a universal pre-K, and also eliminating the school resource officer program, which in Maryland means no police officers in the schools. And so that touches a lot of different things. It touches criminal justice, affordable housing, it touches mental health, and it also touches the budget. And I think by looking at these issues in a comprehensive way, then we can really start to make sustainable change, especially as it relates to education reform.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sort of on that topic of intersectionality and looking at issues in a comprehensive way, in your platform, you specifically mentioned that changing the perception of climate change as more than just an environmental issue is extremely significant and integral to addressing the problem. So, can you expand a little bit on that and how you, as governor, will work to involve more groups such as unions, people of color, basically groups beyond just the environmental groups in supporting this intersectional issue?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we progressives talk about climate change, we only talk about climate change in that bucket. And while that's great to energize us, it doesn't help us build enough coalitions that we need to actually make some of these sustainable changes. And so that's why I talk about it's also a great economic opportunity. It's not just a threat. It's also addresses a lot of the racial inequities that we're facing. And for me, as someone, like I said, who's kind of lived in different kinds of geographies, I understand, the fear of urban expansion, of rising sea levels, of protecting our agricultural lands, and also making sure to understand where people live as it relates to transit opportunities and just transportation infrastructure as a whole. So some specifics that I'm working on are, climate justice. So we have a commission on environmental justice that doesn't really have equitable representation on the committee. There's not a lot of transparency in terms of how they meet and kind of the recommendations they make to the governor's office. Making sure as a state we're banning fracking, we're deactivating our coal power plants, while also putting in a place to transition the employees of those power plants into cleaner jobs. Making sure we're stopping subsidizing trash incinerators. Right now in Maryland, trash incinerators are still listed as renewable energy sources. That's obviously not true. When I talk about investing in solar, investing in hydro and wind power, I think those are really important. Looking at transportation, right, making it more accessible, making sure that as we grow our cities and our towns, we're doing more mixed use development and smart growth. When we talk about home construction, right, making sure that they're built from the get-go to be net zero energy, because that's also a lot more affordable if you do it while they're being constructed rather than later on. And then, making composting a lot more easier, banning single-use plastic bags, ending the state funding of synthetic turf on playgrounds. I think a lot of these issues we already know the solutions for, but again, we're not addressing them sustainably. We're not addressing them comprehensively. And for whatever reason, we don't have elected officials or enough of them that are ready to take those bold initiatives.
How about specifically looking at like the current infrastructure that's already there? Like, do you have any specific plans in sort of transitioning that to increase like energy efficiency and greener initiatives involving just the current infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about infrastructure, right? So if we look at, for example, solar power, right, requiring that there's solar panels on existing government buildings, school buildings, looking at the grassy medians on highways to put more solar panels on there, home construction, like I said, right, making sure that we're doing it while the homes are being constructed, because it's a lot cheaper than installing later. When I talk about hydro, water power, using what other cities have done, like Portland, that has these lucid energy pipes that produce power as water flows through the cities. That is, those are structural systems that we can change. When I'm talking about wind, offshore wind farms in Maryland, right off of Ocean City, can really help generate a lot of power while cutting carbon dioxide emissions. When I'm talking about, banning single-use plastic bags, right, making sure that we are taking the system we already have, but making it more affordable, and also have timelines and deadlines in place so that we actually move toward that system much quicker. When I talk about infrastructure as a whole, right, investing more in Maryland, we have a purple line and a red line projects. These are metro systems that have been delayed and postponed or not dedicated funding for. They're going to connect a lot of residents to jobs, especially low income and more minority owned and minority populated areas, to jobs in two different communities. And so as governor, making sure we're reprioritizing those projects, making sure that whenever we have transportation infrastructure projects as a whole, we're always considering the costs, the local concerns of the residents who might be displaced, and also making sure that, again, we have accountability and transparency. These are some of the things that have not been done by our current governor, that have been delayed projects and just have only increased the traffic, increased pollution, and decreased some of the job opportunities that we could have in our state.
Yeah, and you sort of touched on what I was going to go into next in terms of, I just personally found it really interesting that you included the issue of transportation and infrastructure in your platform. Um, but would you want to expand more? I know that you have talked about it a little, but just more on what you believe to be the main issues with Maryland's current transportation system, as well as looking into more possible solutions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, right. It touches on climate change. It touches on affordable housing. But I think, again, when we're looking at the systems and the structures, right now, what we have seen when it looks at infrastructure, when it looks at transportation as a whole, there's a lot of money that could connect isolated Black neighborhoods in Baltimore, for example, to downtown job centers and other rail lines. But the current governor has redirected a lot of those funds to building roads instead in predominantly white neighborhoods, right? And so it's looking at how do we prioritize our budget and prioritize our residents so that, again, we're looking at this issue of infrastructure in not just a silo, but in many different buckets. And again, not only is that going to help our communities, not only is it going to help reduce some of the racial inequities that we're seeing, but it's better for our economy. It's better for our climate. And right, so making those connections and showing people that we can accomplish a lot of this, but we just have to be more mindful of the leaders that we put in place at all levels and the kinds of way we're approaching and discussing these issues.
Yeah, you do mention what the lack of action that the current governor who is in power right now is like taking the lack of action just overall towards combating these issues maybe efficiently. So then on that sort of note, what makes you a better candidate for Maryland as governor than other people on the ticket?
Yeah, so as a starting point, right, our current governor, he is termed out next year, so it's a completely vacant seat. For that reason, my primary is going to be really competitive. I'm the first candidate to announce this year, the second overall. There are probably going to be anywhere from 10 to 15 great Democrats that jump in. And our primary is June 2022. So it's a good year and a half. But, like I said, it is, I think what makes me a competitive candidate and more electable and also I think a better leader is the fact that I understand both how the systems of power work, and I also understand the day-to-day lives of people in my state. I understand the real impact of the policies, and I think those are two qualities that I don't think a lot of other candidates are going to have, and also will allow me not only to win this election, but also be a really great leader for the residents of my state, and a leader that hopefully people can be proud of.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Sort of extrapolating from what I did ask in the beginning about what the biggest or most pressing issue Maryland was facing today is, what do you believe the biggest issue the nation is facing today is? And like, how do you believe you fit in sort of as like a potential governor for Maryland in that overall for the country?
I think nationwide, it's a lot of the same issues, right? These structural changes that are not necessarily happening in different states or even necessarily at the federal level. Getting money out of politics, I think, is really important. Looking at issues really in a comprehensive way. And then the final piece, and I think this really relates to the things that I'm so proud of to see with your organization, this idea of increasing the youth vote and engaging more young people, right? One of the things that I've always seen is in every election, there's always talk from leaders, especially even on the Democratic side, that we need more young and diverse volunteers, but there's a disconnect with their words and their actions, because not only do I often find myself as still one of the youngest and few people of color at political meetings and events, not only statewide, but nationwide. But I've also seen such a quick dismissal anytime people like us attempt to pursue leadership roles that challenge the status quo or focus on issues that we are going to be held accountable for in the future, even when we are prepared to do the necessary work, right? So it seems as if many that are currently in a lot of these leadership roles, they want our hope, our energy, and determination. They want us to, canvas, to phone bank, to rally, to protest, but only when they decide it's okay. And so I think that is an issue that we're facing and we're seeing all across this country, even though as a nation, the demographics are changing. We as young people are much more powerful when it comes to voting numbers and when it comes to volunteer numbers and volunteer outreach and input. And so now that needs to translate into actual leadership roles and elected positions. And again, we've seen this nationally. I've seen it even in my state starting to happen. But that's one of the things I'm hoping to do is not only open that door of opportunity for me, but keep that door open for anyone who's like me or who feels like they're the underdog, feel like they don't have a seat at the table where decisions about their lives are being made.
Yeah, and that brings me to my last question for today. A lot of youth do want to get involved in politics, but are unsure where to start, especially since a significant part of our base involves youth who can't vote yet. So, what can young people who want to increase their participation in politics and advocacy and activism do specifically in your campaign or in general?
So I'll start with general, right? Regardless of where you are, regardless of who you're supporting or what office you want to get involved with, just start showing up, right? There are Democratic groups and clubs at the local level, state, federal level. Your group does events, right? Hosts events, shares information about different policy initiatives that are coming down the pipeline. So just start educating yourself on the issues, show up to different events and meetings, and raise your hand, ask questions. In terms of my campaign, I think actions matter more than words. And so for me, not only am I, reaching out and getting volunteers from middle schools and high schools and colleges and universities, but I'm giving them senior leadership roles. Not just saying, hey, I want you to join my campaign to phone bank and canvas, but I'm going to make you an advisor. I'm going to help give you an opportunity so you can dictate how policy is created on my team. What are the different kind of outreach strategies we have? So really staying true to what I believe. And so if people want to get involved, they can go to my website, janeforgovernor.com. There's more opportunities that you can find out to get involved. I'm also happy to have as many one-on-one conversations with people and kind of see what they're interested in. But again, really showing that you can run a successful campaign statewide while having a lot of young people as in leadership roles. And that's the narrative that I'm trying to change. And hopefully we can prove that.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for joining me today and for your time and just this overall wonderful conversation. I'm going to give you just a chance to go ahead and say anything that might be on your mind or just any closing remarks.
Again, I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do. The Democratic Youth Coalition, from what I've seen, is really at the forefront of engaging the youth voice, the youth vote, nationally. And I think we just need to keep it going, right? And so my way of keeping it going is by running for office in my state as governor, right at the top of the ticket, expanding the base, making sure we're having the youth voice at the table where all these decisions are going to be made. So thank you for your time. If anyone wants to get involved, again, check out my website, janeforgovernor.com. You can learn more about my experiences, more about my policies, and then reach out, and then I'm happy to have the conversation after that.
Yeah, thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you.